All right, thanks everyone. It's 30 minutes after the hour. We are only 15 minutes behind schedule. I want to belatedly thank our presenters from the last session, the pneumococcal vaccine session, and move on to return to the MMR, measles, mumps, rubella vaccine session. And we will get started with an introduction from Ms. Lynn Bata, who is the chair of the MMR vaccines work group. So Ms. Bata, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. I'm going to be providing a brief introduction to the MMR vaccine as Priorix session. Next slide, please. In June of this month, the FDA approved GlaxoSmithKline's MMR vaccine, Priorix. Until this month, there's only been one licensed MMR vaccine product in the U.S., and that was MMR-II, manufactured by Merck. MMR is currently recommended for administration on or after 12 months of age for the prevention of measles, mumps, and rubella, and is recommended as post-exposure prophylaxis as well. Additionally, MMR is recommended for off-label use in two situations: for infants ages 6 to 12 months planning to travel or live abroad, and also during outbreaks, and for a third dose in previously vaccinated persons with 2 doses who are identified as being at increased risk because of a mumps outbreak. Since January of this year, the MMR vaccine work group has been meeting to evaluate the safety and immunogenicity of Priorix as compared to MMR-II. Next slide, please. The work group has been led by Dr. Elizabeth Kroll-Lucal, who has championed efficiency to bring us to today and a vote. And I'd also like to acknowledge Jamie Lair as the other ACIP member in the work group, and appreciate and thank the involvement and input that has been provided by ex officio and liaison work group members and participants. Next slide, please. In February, we heard a presentation by GSK on the safety and immunogenicity of Priorix as compared to MMR-II. And today we are going to have Dr. Kroll-Lucal take us through the evidence to recommendations, provide a brief literature review, and bring us to the proposed recommendations of the work group. And with that, I will leave the slides to you, Dr. Kroll-Lucal.
Good afternoon. My name is Liz Kroll-Lucal. I will be presenting the Evidence to Recommendations Framework and Literature Review on Priorix for the prevention of measles, mumps, and rubella for the MMR vaccines work group. Our policy question is, should MMR vaccine Priorix, manufactured by GSK, be recommended as an option according to currently recommended schedules and off-label uses to prevent measles, mumps, and rubella? The population is persons aged 6 months or older. The intervention is GSK's Priorix. And the comparator is the existing MMR vaccine licensed in the United States, MMR-II, manufactured by Merck. The outcomes of interest are prevention of measles, mumps, and rubella, short-term humoral immunity, persistence of the humoral immune response, reactogenicity grade 3 or higher, and serious adverse events, including conditions of interest identified by ACIP and the work group, including febrile seizures, aseptic meningitis, and immune thrombocytopenic purpura. As previously presented to ACIP, Priorix was first licensed in Germany in 1997. It has been approved in over 100 countries outside of the US, and over 400 million doses have been distributed worldwide. Countries where Priorix has been approved include all European Union countries, Canada, Australia, and many others worldwide. It has also been pre-qualified by WHO. The map on the right shows the 97 countries where Priorix is currently registered. Priorix is considered fully interchangeable with MMR-II or MMR VaxPro in a number of countries. This slide presents the vaccine components of MMR2 in the second column and Priorix in the third. Both contain live attenuated measles, mumps, and rubella viruses. MMR2 and Priorix contain the same strains for mumps and rubella and a similar lineage of measles. Both the measles and rubella strains found in MMR2 and Priorix are 100% identical on a nucleotide level. The Geraldine strain used in the mumps component of MMR2 is a mixture of two viral lineages, JL1 and JL2. RIT 4385, the mumps component from GSK, is a pure clone of JL1 and is 100% identical on a protein level to Merck's JL1 component. For differences in inactive ingredients, MMR2 contains porcine gelatin and Priorix does not. This table shows the minimum and maximum potencies for both MMR2 and Priorix in the United States. According to FDA's requirements for live viral vaccines, minimum and maximum viral potency titers for Priorix were defined during clinical development to ensure efficacy at minimum potency and an acceptable safety profile at maximum potency. The lines show the range from minimum to maximum potencies for MMR2 in orange and Priorix as licensed in the US in purple. GSK will be changing the dosage for all countries to align with the US dosage. We will now discuss the Evidence to Recommendations Framework, ETR, domains. Attaining and maintaining high two-dose MMR coverage has led to measles and rubella elimination in the US and low levels of mumps. The bottom graph shows cases of measles, mumps, and rubella from 1970 through 2021. The inset on the upper right shows the increase of measles and mumps in recent years due to locally acquired and importation-related cases and outbreaks. Given this, the work group is of the opinion that yes, the prevention of these diseases is a problem of public health importance. We will now discuss the available evidence regarding how substantial the desirable and undesirable anticipated effects are of Priorix compared with currently used MMR2. To assess safety and immunogenicity of Priorix, we conducted a literature review. Studies in any language were identified from the listed databases using the search string presented on the slide. Results were limited to randomized controlled trials or systematic reviews and meta-analyses. Of the 918 studies identified, 18 were relevant to the PICO question, 16 randomized controlled trials that compared Priorix and MMR2 head-to-head, and 2 systematic reviews that included Priorix-specific information. An additional 5 studies with a different study design or comparator vaccine were also reviewed for safety data on conditions of interest identified by the work group and ACIP. For safety data, we focused on the 4 randomized controlled trials using the licensed US dose and 2 reviews and 5 studies with different designs or dosages to assess specific safety conditions indicated in February by ACIP. These are the characteristics of the 4 randomized controlled trials using the licensed US dose. The majority of the studies were conducted in the US, with roughly 2/3 of participants receiving Priorix and 90 receiving a first dose of MMR. There was no significant difference in race and ethnicity between the Priorix and MMR2 groups. None of the studies examined prevention of disease directly. All 4 reported serious adverse events, or SAEs, and reactogenicity of grade 3 or higher. All studies used a comparator vaccine, as it would be unethical to compare against placebo alone in this situation. From these studies and studies previously presented to ACIP, Priorix shows a similar safety profile to MMR2. Follow-up time in these studies was from 40 days to 6 months post-MMR vaccination. The frequency of vaccine-related SAEs was low, ranging from 0 to 0.2% for the Priorix group and 0 to 0.3% in the MMR2 group. Vaccine-related SAEs identified in clinical trials were immune thrombocytopenic purpura, 1 participant each in both the MMR2 and Priorix groups, inguinal adenitis in 1 Priorix participant, and 1 complex febrile seizure in an MMR2 participant. Additional safety information was collected from the literature based on questions from ACIP and workgroup members on conditions of interest. These conditions of interest were indicated in February by ACIP and include febrile seizures, aseptic meningitis, and immune thrombocytopenic purpura, or ITP, compared to the current vaccine, MMR2. Because these events are very rare, it is difficult to identify this risk in the RCTs. For that reason, we looked more broadly in the literature. The rate of febrile seizures is highest in the 6 to 11 days following vaccination for all MMR vaccines. The rate of febrile seizures in this period is estimated to be 3.3 to 8.7 per 10,000 doses based on 2 studies conducted in the UK, which included both Priorix and MMR2. From the clinical trials data provided by GSK and presented to ACIP in February, at the target, minimum, and maximum potencies, the rate of febrile seizures in the Priorix group was 9.5 per 10,000 doses in 8,300 children studied, and I believe this is actually a typo, 8.8 per 10,000 doses in approximately 4,500 children studied. All studies, I believe that range is incorrect. I'll double check and come back. All studies included age-appropriate vaccine co-administration, and all studies found the differences in rates of febrile seizures to be non-significant between the 2 vaccines. Similarly, the time course of fever was comparable for both vaccines across all studies, with the majority of instances observed 5 to 12 days post-vaccination. The second issue raised was aseptic meningitis. While this has not been studied in a randomized controlled trial, a paper from 2007 in the UK used active surveillance to identify aseptic meningitis and mumps meningitis in the 15 to 35 days post-vaccination from 1998 to 2004. This was a comparison to the rate of the previously licensed vaccine in the UK, which contained the Urabe 9 strain of mumps, which is known to be associated with aseptic meningitis. 2 separate case definitions were used for aseptic meningitis, ICD-9 and 10 codes and chart review for aseptic meningitis, and laboratory-confirmed mumps meningitis cases. In this time period, 0 cases of aseptic meningitis were identified from ICD-9 and 10 code and chart review out of 99,177 doses of Priorix given, and 0 cases of laboratory-confirmed mumps meningitis were identified out of approximately 1.6 million doses of Priorix given. Based on the number of doses and cases observed in the time frame, risks as rare as 1 in 437,000 doses could be excluded for Priorix. Additional doses would need to be observed to rule out rarer risks. In addition, the WHO Global Advisory Committee on Safety did not find any cases of virologically proven aseptic meningitis following Gerolin vaccination, and the most recent Cochrane review from 2021 states that there is no evidence of association between aseptic meningitis and vaccines prepared with the Gerolin strains, which includes RIT 4385, the mumps component found in Priorix. The third condition of interest was ITP, which is associated with the receipt of live attenuated measles vaccines. There is very limited brand-specific data available on ITP. From the 4 RCTs at the U.S. dosage of Priorix, there was 1 case each in the Priorix and MMR2 groups. By comparison, for MMR2, a vaccine safety data link study reported a rate of 2.5 cases per 100,000 doses. In the literature, data is available from 3 studies and a Cochrane review. All show an association with ITP. However, the case definition varied across papers. ITP is a very rare event, and when examining vaccine-specific events, the denominator is small, leading to large confidence intervals and uncertainty around the point estimates of rate ratios, as presented in the slide. Based on the limited estimates available, our best interpretation is that the rates and rate ratios for MMR2 versus Priorix are not different from each other. In summary, there was a similar rate and severity of febrile seizures after vaccination with Priorix or MMR2. There is no evidence of association of aseptic meningitis with vaccines prepared with Gerald Lynn strains, and risks as rare as 1 in 437,000 doses can be excluded. Finally, based on the limited data available, there were similar rates of ITP after vaccination with Priorix or MMR2. We will now review the available information on immunogenicity of Priorix compared to MMR2. Of the 16 RCTs, 13 had immunogenicity data, 4 at the licensed U.S. dose and 9 at a lower Priorix dose. All were reviewed for measles, mumps, and rubella seroconversion after first or second dose, as well as geometric mean concentration, or titer, GMC, after first or second dose. The following figures show GMC after first dose of MMR, either Priorix or MMR2. Here you can see the GMC for measles comparing both vaccines by study. Each row represents a different potency. The orange boxes represent MMR2 and the purple boxes Priorix. The size of the boxes represents the number of participants, and the line represents the 95% confidence interval when available. The dotted green vertical line at 200 represents the estimated correlate of protection. The rows at the bottom, highlighted in blue, represent studies conducted at the U.S. dose for Priorix. All studies showed a GMC well above the estimated correlate of protection. Of the 13 RCTs reviewed, 12 showed no difference in anti-measles GMC. Unlike measles, mumps does not have a known correlate of protection. Seropositivity is defined as greater than or equal to 10 ELISA units per ml, shown here with the dotted green vertical line. All studies demonstrated that both vaccines exceeded the minimum threshold, and 10 of 13 studies showed no statistically significant difference between anti-mumps GMC levels. The rubella correlate of protection is estimated to be 10 international units per ml. All studies demonstrated that both vaccines exceeded this threshold, and 12 out of 13 studies showed no statistically significant difference between Priorix and MMR2. In summary, of the studies conducted with the U.S. dosage, there was no significant difference between Priorix and MMR2 GMC for measles, mumps, or rubella. Of the studies conducted at a lower dosage than the U.S., all studies showed a GMC higher than the correlate of protection for both measles and rubella, and mumps GMC higher than the seroresponse threshold. 10 out of 13 showed no statistically significant difference between anti-mumps GMC levels. There was no significant difference for second dose between Priorix and MMR2 for measles, mumps, or rubella GMC at any potency. In summary, the work group considered that the difference in both the desirable anticipated effects and the undesirable anticipated effects of Priorix compared with MMR2 were minimal, and the balance between the two favored both. Next, we will discuss feasibility. Is Priorix as an option for MMR vaccination feasible to implement? And acceptability. Is Priorix acceptable to key stakeholders? Between 2000 and mid-2003, the United States experienced occasional shortages of a number of routinely recommended vaccines, including MMR. These shortages were due to 2 voluntary interruptions to manufacturing operations by Merck, both of which took longer to resolve than anticipated and were significant enough that the ACIP recommendations had to be temporarily modified, including suspension of the second dose of MMR in cases of insufficient vaccine quantities. Redundancy in supply is a critical component of sustainable public health. An important point to note here is that MMR-V, MMR and varicella combination vaccine, accounts for roughly 13%, ranging from 5 to 24%, of first doses and roughly 80%, 52 to 98%, of second doses in this childhood vaccine series. This is from unpublished data provided by the Immunization Services Division at CDC. Given this, the workgroup considered that an additional MMR vaccine, Priorix, that is safe and non-inferior to the existing MMR vaccine, MMR-II, could be beneficial in maintaining measles and rubella elimination and mitigating mumps outbreaks in the United States, as well as assuring supplier diversity. To assess feasibility and acceptability, we conducted a focus group with state health department immunization managers to identify potential barriers to Priorix. Participants noted that the majority of VFC and vaccine programs order based on providers' demand and that this is the main factor driving new vaccine adoption. Adding Priorix into the routine immunization system, vaccine access, distribution, storage and handling, and implementation of communication and education strategies were not considered barriers. Participants welcomed the idea of having another brand available in case of outbreaks or manufacturing interruptions. In addition, one participant noted the benefit of having a gelatin-free vaccine, Priorix, for religious populations. We also conducted a survey of 400 pediatricians and 400 family medicine practitioners. Participants were asked a number of questions, including on their current MMR vaccination practices and barriers to having a second MMR product. The key findings from the survey as related to feasibility were concerns about the possibility of not being able to mix and match doses. A quarter of participants reported having patients who did not receive an MMR vaccine due to allergy to a vaccine component. Of those, 30 to 40% reported that the allergy was to gelatin. And the majority of pediatricians have used the MMR vaccine for patients under the age of 1. In summary, the major categories identified were concerns that the vaccines were not fully interchangeable, including off-label usage, and a potential benefit for a gelatin-free vaccine to serve potentially allergic patients. Given the concerns identified around interchangeability in the survey, we looked at the available evidence for interchangeability. Previously presented studies showed non-inferior responses and similar safety profiles for individuals receiving a first dose with MMR-II or ProQuad and a second dose of Priorix. A number of countries, including but not limited to Australia, Canada, Denmark, France, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and Ireland, consider Priorix and MMR-II, or MMR VaxPro, to be fully interchangeable. In addition, both the FDA and European Medicines Agency allow for vaccination with Priorix in individuals who have previously been vaccinated with a different MMR vaccine. However, there is limited data on interchangeability for those who receive Priorix as a first dose, followed by MMR-II or ProQuad. In the available data, there were no safety or immunogenicity differences identified, as expected, given the vaccine component similarity. In summary, the workgroup considered that Priorix is acceptable to key stakeholders and feasible to implement. However, the workgroup is of the opinion that differences in off-label uses and interchangeability recommendations could negatively affect both the acceptability and feasibility. MMR-II and Priorix will have the same VFC price. Given this and the similarities in formulation and storage, the workgroup considered that there would probably be no impact on health equity for Priorix as compared to MMR-II. Finally, the work group considered that the values and resource use based on similarities of schedule, anticipated harms and benefits, and VFC cost, the two vaccines are comparable with values and resource use similar to that of MMR2. Based on ETR considerations, Priorix and MMR2 vaccines are closely balanced, and therefore the work group judgment on adding Priorix as an option for MMR vaccination is as follows. The desirable consequences clearly outweigh the undesirable consequences in most settings. Given the similarities in dosage and vaccine components, evidence from the clinical trials, and literature review, the work group considers that Priorix and MMR2 should be considered fully interchangeable, including all off-label uses, and may be administered in any situation in which a measles, mumps, and rubella containing vaccine is indicated. Here's a short list of the references. And as previously mentioned, a thank you to work group members, in particular, our chair, Ms. Lynn Bata, and our ACIP member, Dr. Lair, as well as our ex officio and liaisons, and our many CDC participants. This concludes my presentation, and I will turn it back over to Dr. Lee.
Thank you very much. And we are going to open this presentation for questions and discussion. I believe we're going to take one brief statement from Dr. Friedland from GSK. Dr. Friedland, I'm just going to ask if, Dr. Long, did you have a quick question?
I do.
Please.
In the 400 million doses in 100 countries, how many other countries give varicella vaccine concurrently with the first dose of Priorix? And do you have data on that? And in the same vein, I'm wondering about adverse events with concurrent boatload of vaccines that we give children at the time we give them their first MMR, and do we have data with PCV and DTAP and ITHIB and all those things we do at the beginning of the second year of life?
Thank you for that question. Quickly to set the record straight before answering, on the slide about febrile seizures, which is on slide 16, the rate for MMR2 should be 14.8, and the N is 3,561. Apologies for the typo. In response to your question, in all of GSK's clinical trials, they did use the routinely given vaccinations at those age groups, including varicella, hepatitis A, PCV, PCV13, as well in the US studies. As for the number of... Go ahead.
Terrific, thank you. And what you were going to say something else. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
No, that's it, thanks.
Well, then I have one more question.
Dr. Long, could I just pause for 1 second? I actually do want to have this discussion, but if we could just turn to Dr. Friedland from GSK. They wanted to make a brief statement, and then I will come back to Dr. Long, Sanchez, and Brooks. We are running a bit behind, Dr. Friedland, so if you could make sure your comments do not exceed 3 minutes, we'd really appreciate it.
Absolutely, Dr. Lee. Can you hear me?
We can.
Great, and I'm from New York, so I can talk quickly. Good afternoon, members of the ACIP and the CDC. I'm Dr. Leonard Friedland with the Medical Affairs team at GSK Vaccines. I want to thank the CDC, the ACIP, and the members of the ACIP MMR work group for their evidence-based review of GSK's U.S. licensed MMR vaccine, Priorix. Before the CDC implemented a measles vaccination program in 1963, an estimated 3 to 4 million people got measles each year in the U.S. Since then, CDC's highly successful public health program, resulting in widespread use of measles virus-containing vaccine, has led to a greater than 99% reduction in measles cases compared with the pre-vaccine era. Recent U.S. measles outbreaks and mumps cases highlight the importance of maintaining high vaccination rates to ensure control of the diseases. The availability of a second MMR vaccine in the U.S. could help mitigate some of this public health risk. This past April, a CDC report noted 400,000 fewer children entered kindergarten in the 2020-21 school year than expected nationally, meaning those children may not be up to date on childhood immunizations. The availability of a second MMR vaccine in the U.S. will ensure healthcare professionals have more than one MMR option as they work to catch their patients up on recommended vaccinations. Data across 5 phase 3 clinical trials enrolling over 16,000 children and adults demonstrate that Priorix is immunologically non-inferior to MMR2 and has a comparable safety profile. The FDA licensed Priorix on June 3rd, 2022. Based on FDA's review of the clinical trial results and use outside the U.S., there are no post-marketing commitments or requirements. ACIP's recommendations and clinical guidance are crucial for providing clarity to providers on appropriate use of a vaccine. Given the immunological and safety profile of Priorix, the committees and their centers' clinical expertise and knowledge of MMR disease and immunization, GSK asked the ACIP to support the use of Priorix in the same routine, catch-up, and special situations for MMR disease prevention and control as with MMR2. On behalf of all my GSK colleagues, we are proud to bring an additional MMR vaccine option for providers and patients in the U.S. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Friedland. We'll move back to Dr. Long.
Yes. Is there a combined Priorix varicella vaccine that would be acceptable to 4 to 6-year-olds? That's number one. And number two, on your last, I think it was your last slide, you said this vaccine could be substituted when M, M, and R are required. I think that should be or, because an off-label use is obviously, if you just need measles, you're going to have to, for like a 7-month-old or an 8-month-old, you're going to have to get MMR. So question about, is there a varicella combined? Because I do believe that our previous recommendation was a preference for MMRV as the second dose to reduce numbers of injections. And you, I'm sure, know that better than my memory.
So there is an MMRV vaccine, Priorix Tetra, that is licensed outside of the U.S. I do not have any information on whether GSK will bring that to the U.S. In terms of your second question on the recommendation for MMRV as compared to MMR, as noted from the information that we were able to get from our immunization colleagues, a majority of second dose in the United States is given as MMRV. Here the range represents different rates in different states. So that is a consideration.
But do you remember if MMRV, David Kimberlin, I'm sure, is on the line, and he knows what the Red Book says, that MMRV is preferred over MMR plus V at 4 to 6. Therefore, this vaccine would not be preferred for the second dose.
Hi, Dr. Long. This is Dr. Mona Marin. Yes, MMRV is preferred for the second dose because it's part of preference given to combination vaccines. So it's nothing, not based on any immunogenicity or safety data. And for the first dose, the recommendation is that providers can give either MMR and varicella or MMRV, but they should discuss the option with the parents. And if the parents prefer MMRV, they would give MMRV. Otherwise, the CDC recommendation is to go with separate vaccination because of the increased risk for febrile seizures after MMRV for the first dose for young children.
Yeah, that's exactly how I remembered it. So are we going to have to say something about MMR plus V? If you use this vaccine for the second dose, would require two injections?
I think in this situation,
one option.
It would be used the same as MMR2. So if a provider was going to give MMR2 as a second dose, this would be an option there. So if they were giving MMR2 alone, and then they would have to do the same for the non-combination vaccine.
Which is not preferred. Yeah.
Thank you. And I was just going to clarify that I think some of the question might be answered by putting the language up so that we could actually have that for further discussion. But let's go to Dr. Sanchez.
Yes, thank you. And getting to Dr. Long's comment, I don't believe the Red Book actually says, and David may comment about a preferential one for MMRV at 4 to 5 years of age, but I may be wrong. But regardless of that, and certainly that would need to be explained to the parents. But with respect to this vaccine, certainly it's great that we have another vaccine that is available. I assume that the storage is similar to MMR. The storage requirements to prevent heat inactivation is similar to MMR?
Yes. The difference is that Priorix should be stored refrigerated, not frozen. But that's similar to other routinely given vaccinations.
Okay. And then did any of these studies actually, did you look for allergic reactions? Because without, and I know this was brought up by the survey, the urticaria and so-called allergic reactions to MMR that have been possibly attributed to gelatin. Did you at all assess allergic reactions to this vaccine versus compared to the MMR, the traditional one, the other one?
So I will caveat the survey results with, we asked only if a vaccination had been declined because of an allergy. We did not ask if it was a clinically verified allergy. So of those in the survey, we don't have a good understanding of how many would be true allergies to be concerned about. In terms of the differences, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm going.
In terms of the differences in potential allergic reaction, there is limited data available, and it was not looked at in these clinical trials. There is literature primarily from Japan looking at the removal of gelatin from all vaccines that could be of interest, but it was not specifically looked at in these trials.
And finally, my last question, this new vaccine is also egg-based?
Sorry, can you repeat that last bit?
That the new vaccine, Priorix, is also egg-based?
Yes.
Chicken embryo cell culture? Okay. Thank you.
Okay, and I see Dr. Kimberlin has raised his hand because your name was called out several times. Dr. Kimberlin, please go ahead.
David Kimberlin, AAP Red Book editor. In terms of the wording in the Red Book on MMRV versus MMR plus varicella vaccine, it reads as follows: either MMRV or separate MMR and varicella vaccines are acceptable options for dose 1 at 12 through 15 months of age, and pediatricians should discuss risks and benefits of the vaccine choices with the parents or caregivers. For the first dose of measles, mumps, rubella, and varicella vaccine at ages 48 months and older, and for dose 2 at any age, 15 months through 12 years, use of MMR-V vaccine generally is preferred over separate injections in MMR and varicella vaccines to minimize the number of injections.
Thank you, Dr. Kimberlin. Dr. Brooks, I cannot hear you, but it might be me.
No, I couldn't hear you for a moment. So yes, thank you. Yes. Could you go back to slide 17, I believe it is. And it's a question regarding the aseptic meningitis. All right, so the third bullet, was this found in Priorix vaccinated individuals only, or is this also found in MMR too?
So this study was conducted in the UK, and prior to this, the vaccine that was licensed in the UK contained the Rubella strain of mumps, which has been associated with aseptic meningitis. And so when that was replaced with Priorix, there was an interest in making sure that Priorix specifically was not associated with aseptic meningitis. So in this case, that is Priorix specific, and the paper was comparing to the previous Rubella strain.
Okay. And then could you quickly go to slide 23. I just had a brief question there. And it was the fact that, and for mumps specifically, because of the beyond the correlative protection for immunogenicity is pretty close. I just noticed that there were no confidence intervals for the 4 U.S. studies at the bottom, and then the two of them above that. Is that correct? That you just didn't have confidence intervals for those studies?
I think they do have confidence intervals, but given the scale and the range of the differences, they are obscured.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Crowley-Call, would you be willing to put up the slide for consideration for a vote? And others, please feel free to ask any additional questions in the meantime.
So here we have the proposed language that MMR vaccine, Priorix, is recommended according to currently recommended schedules and off-label uses as an option to prevent measles, mumps, and rubella.
Any questions or additional considerations that members would like to bring up? Dr. Long.
Yeah, in reference to then what Dr. Kimberlin reported, and the CDC has the same recommendations to use combination vaccines when combination vaccine is available and is safe. I wonder if we need to say, I don't know that we need to say here, but we need to say somewhere there currently is no combination MMR-V vaccine, which precludes, I don't know, that's too strong, isn't it? Precludes its use as a second vaccine. I think it probably would require exactly what you have to do when you want to use MMR-V for a first. You'd have to discuss with families that you can get this vaccine, but you're going to have to get a second, the plus V, and the V in another injection. Seems to me that families should know. Rather, what I'm thinking is doctors may get in their offices one or the other. And it may be on a cost basis, or it may be, I don't know what the basis will be. But if it's preferred that you use combination vaccine on the second dose, it's preferred. So you would have to tell the family that you're doing this in a less preferred way. So I think you'd have to tell them rather than just say, I got a better deal on the GSK vaccine, so I'm going to give your child 2 injections at 4 to 6 years instead of 1, and not discuss this with you. What does anybody else think?
I definitely think that that's something that we can put in the MMWR clinical considerations. This is not being recommended as a replacement for MMRV, merely as an additional option. And so having that language available that MMRV is preferred will still be in place.
Ms. Bata.
I think that we need to go back to the focus of the language that this is a vaccine that can be used interchangeably with MMR2, and that all of the rules and the recommendations would apply, and that would include if a provider is using combination vaccine, and they already have to have that conversation if they're using separate or combined. So I think we want to stay relevant to the proposed language.
Thank you, Ms. Bata. Dr. Paling.
Ms. Bata, I agree with you. I think that's really important. I do want to highlight that when you're working in a large health system, there are better deals if you use predominantly of one or another product by a manufacturer. And so I do want to emphasize the importance of giving providers the freedom to use products from different manufacturers. And I think that's an important component. But I do like the recommendations. And Dr. Lee, if I have permission, can I make a motion to approve the language as written?
Please do. All right. So I'm hearing a motion for the proposed recommendation for the MMR vaccine as listed on the slide. Do I have a second? Dr. Talbot?
Second.
Thank you. It's been moved and seconded that we adopt the recommendation language on this slide for the MMR vaccine. And we will, again, return to the vote after the public comment later this afternoon. Thank you, everybody, for the discussion, and thank you to our presenters today and your leadership of this work group, Ms. Bata. Okay. I think what we'll have to do, I'm just going to confirm, I'm going to give a few minutes to my colleagues in the room in Atlanta so that we can take a moment to break and move to our public comment session. So please stay tuned. Give us about 3 to 5 minutes. Thank you.